The shirt had been ironed. That alone should have meant something. Daniel Calloway sat alone at a table for two inside Rosario's, the woman across from him already gone. Walked out after less than 20 minutes, before the conversation had found any ground to stand on. He reached for his wallet jaw, tight ready to pay, and disappear into the parking lot and pretend this night never happened. Then the waitress leaned down beside him close enough that only he could hear, and said quietly, "If I were you, I'd stay." He looked up. She was already turning away. Greg Harmon had been making the same argument for months. "You can't keep living like a ghost, Dan. You're 42 years old." Dan had heard it so many times he could repeat it back word for word. He always had a reason to say no. Too tired, too busy, not ready. The reasons were real, but they were also a wall, and he knew it, and he kept building it anyway. Then, one Tuesday evening, Noah looked up from his homework at the kitchen table and asked without any preamble, the way 10-year-olds ask things, "Dad, are you lonely?" Dan had opened his mouth and nothing came out. Noah had already turned back to his worksheet, but the question stayed. It followed Dan through the next 3 weeks like a shadow he couldn't shake. So when Greg called again on a Wednesday and said he'd already made the reservation, Dan said yes before he could talk himself out of it. The restaurant was called Rosario's, an Italian place on the east side of Clarksville that Greg had chosen because, in his words, it was not too fancy, not too casual. The woman's name was Cheryl Voss, a friend of Greg's wife, independent, successful. Dan hadn't asked much beyond that. He figured the less he built it up, the less there was to lose. He stood in the bathroom that Friday evening, buttoning the navy blue shirt Claire had always said looked best on him. He hadn't worn it in over a year. He wasn't sure why he reached for it tonight. He didn't examine the question too closely. He just got in the car and drove. Rosario's was warm when he walked in amber light white tablecloths, the low hum of a jazz track underneath the dinner crowd. Near the entrance, he bumped lightly into a waitress, carrying a loaded tray. He caught the edge of it without thinking, and steadied it before anything could slide. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. The waitress' dark hair, sharp eyes looked at him for a beat that lasted just slightly longer than a standard thank you. "No harm done," she said, and moved on. Dan found his table and sat down to wait. Cheryl Voss arrived 8 minutes late. She was dressed well-expensive coat heels that clicked across the tile, and she carried herself like someone doing the room a favor by showing up. She sat down across from Dan, glanced at the menu without greeting him, and set her phone face up on the table. Dan introduced himself. Cheryl gave a short nod, the kind that meant she'd already formed a conclusion. He asked how she knew Greg's wife. She gave a 3-sentence answer and immediately looked at her phone screen. Dan tried again, mentioned that Rosario's had good reviews, asked if she'd been here before. Cheryl said she didn't really follow local places. Her tone wasn't rude exactly. It was something flatter than rude. It was indifferent. He mentioned Noah kept it brief, just that he had a son 10 years old. Good kid. Cheryl glanced up from her phone. "I'm not really interested in children," she said, the same way someone might say they didn't follow baseball. Matter of fact. Final. Dan nodded and reached for his water glass. A few minutes later, when the conversation turned to work and Dan said he was a civil engineer, Cheryl tilted her head slightly. I thought Greg said you did something more interesting than that." She wasn't trying to be cruel. She just wasn't trying to be anything. Dan kept his expression even. He was good at that. He'd had practice. The waitress from the entrance, the one he'd bumped into, came to take their order. Dan watched Cheryl barely look at her, watched her wave a hand in the direction of the menu and say, "Just water," without making eye contact. The waitress wrote it down without reaction and moved on. Dan ordered a glass of red wine and a bowl of soup he didn't particularly want. He needed something to do with his hands. The worst moment came quietly, the way the worst moments usually do. Cheryl looked around the restaurant at the checkered tablecloths, the small candles, the crayon drawings of the Colosseum on the walls, and made a sound low in her throat. "I genuinely don't understand why Greg picked this place," she said. "It's so ordinary." She didn't lower her voice. The couple at the next table heard it. Dan saw the woman glance over. He looked down at his soup. He was not yet 20 minutes into the worst evening he'd had in recent memory when Cheryl set her napkin on the table and reached for her coat. "Something came up," she said, standing. "Work thing. You should just get the check. I only had water, so." She didn't apologize. She didn't really look at him. She just walked out, heels clicking back across the tile, and the door swung shut behind her. The restaurant kept moving around Dan like nothing had happened. The jazz track changed. A table nearby laughed at something. He sat with an untouched glass of wine and Cheryl's still full water glass, and felt the specific quiet humiliation of a man who had ironed his shirt for this. He reached for his wallet. He didn't flag anyone down, didn't order anything else. He just wanted to pay and get to the parking lot and drive home and not think about any of it until tomorrow at least. The waitress came over before he could signal her. She set the check down on the table and didn't move. She stood there for a moment, and Dan noticed she'd been the one refilling the water glasses at the next table all evening, which meant she'd been close enough to hear most of what had happened. She looked at him not with pity, not with the rehearsed sympathy of someone doing their job. Just looked at him level and clear. Then she leaned down slightly and said quietly enough that only he could hear, "If I were you, I'd stay." Dan looked up. "I'm sorry." She offered a brief, composed smile. Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen, already moving on to the next table. Dan sat with the check in his hand. He stood up. Then he sat back down. Dan flagged her down when she passed his table again. He asked for a coffee. It was a thin excuse to stay, and he knew it, but it was the only one he had, so he used it. The check was still sitting on the table in front of him. He'd slid it to the side without quite deciding anything. The restaurant was still moving around him, tables turning over, conversations blurring together. But the momentum of leaving had gone out of him the moment she said those words, and he hadn't gotten it back. When Mara returned with the coffee, she set it down and started to move on. Dan spoke before she could. "Why did you say that?" he asked. "What you said about staying." "Why?" Mara stood with the empty tray under her arm. She looked at him the same way she had at the entrance earlier, direct, unhurried. "Because you looked like someone who needed a better end to the evening," she said. "Not one that finished the way that did." She said it plainly without performance, and then she left to attend to another table. Dan wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. He wasn't sure what he'd expected her to say. Something deflecting, maybe just being friendly, just doing her job. Instead, she'd answered him like it was a reasonable question that deserved a real answer. He sat with that for a moment. The coffee was strong, and the mug was heavy, and the restaurant was slowly thinning out around him, the later dinner crowd settling into dessert, and the bar side beginning to fill instead. Over the next 30 minutes, Mara came back to his table a handful of times, refilling the coffee, clearing the check, once just passing close enough that she glanced over and said, "Still here," without breaking stride, in a tone that wasn't teasing so much as noting a fact. Dan found himself watching the room less and looking toward the kitchen door more. He wasn't sure when that had shifted. Dan asked her at some point how long she'd worked at Rosario's. Mara said 3 years. Long enough, she added, to know who's having a genuinely terrible night and who just thinks they are. Dan looked at her. "Which one am I?" "The first kind," she said without hesitation. By 9:30, Rosario's had gone quiet enough that the jazz track felt louder than it actually was. Most of the tables had cleared. The couple near the window were on their last glass of wine. 2 servers were rolling silverware at the back station. Mara came over during a lull in service, and instead of simply refilling the coffee and moving on, she pulled out the chair across from Dan Cheryl's chair and sat down. She didn't ask if that was all right. She just sat. Dan found that he didn't mind at all. For a few minutes, neither of them said much that meant anything. She mentioned that Friday nights usually ran later than this. He said something about the drive across town. Small talk, the kind you use to test the temperature before anything real. Then Mara asked, without making a big thing of it, whether the woman who left was someone he knew well. Dan shook his head. First time we'd met, he said. Blind date. Friend set it up. Mara nodded once. Like that explained the whole evening in 3 words. Those are hard, she said. Walking in cold like that. Dan almost laughed. Yeah, he said. Turns out. He didn't plan to say anything about Claire. It came out the way things sometimes do when you're tired and the room is quiet, and the person across from you isn't filling every silence with noise. Mara had asked how long he'd been in Clarksville, and Dan said most of his adult life, and then said that he'd raised his son here, and then, before he'd made a conscious decision about it, said that his wife had passed 4 years ago. He said it simply without collapsing the sentence under the weight of it. Mara didn't flinch, didn't over-apologize. She just said, what was she like? And that was the right question. That was exactly the right question. And he hadn't been asked it in a very long time. He told her about Claire, the way you tell someone about a person when you're not performing grief, and you're not protecting yourself from it. Either. Just remembering. He said that Claire used to laugh every time he tried to cook something from scratch. Not at him, exactly, but at the optimism of it, the fact that he'd attempt a new recipe on a Tuesday, like it was ever going to go well. He said Noah had her eyes that particular shade of brown that was almost amber in certain light, and that sometimes he'd look at his son across the dinner table and feel 2 things at once that didn't have any business existing in the same moment. Mara listened. She didn't redirect, didn't offer silver linings, didn't look at the clock. She just listened. Then Mara said, I had a marriage that didn't last. She said it the same way she'd said everything else, level, no performance in either direction. It had lasted 5 years. Her ex-husband had told her near the end of it that she was too ordinary, too settled, that he'd expected her to become something else by now, and she hadn't. He wasn't wrong that I was ordinary, she said. He was just wrong about what that meant. She'd moved to Clarksville from Nashville about 3 years ago, around the time she started at Rosario's. She was taking classes 3 nights a week at the community college, working toward a nursing degree. She wasn't in a hurry about it. She was just doing it 1 semester at a time. Dan watched her talk and thought about how different this was from every version of the evening he had imagined driving over here. Mara wasn't performing warmth. She wasn't trying to make him feel better. She was just being honest. And she was curious about him in a way that felt uncommon, the way people are curious when they actually want to know, not when they're waiting for their turn to speak. He hadn't felt that in a long time. He said, looking down at the mug, I don't know how to do this right. Being a single dad. I feel like every decision I make, I'm 1 wrong call away from messing him up. It wasn't something he'd said out loud before, not to Greg, not to anyone. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the fathers who don't worry about that are the ones who are actually messing up their kids. Dan looked at her. Something in his chest came loose. He laughed, not politely, not carefully, but the kind of laugh that comes out when something lands exactly where it was aimed. It had been years since he'd laughed like that. He noticed the time when one of the other servers started stacking chairs at the far end of the room. It was nearly 10:30. He had been inside Rosario's for over 2 hours, and the last hour of that had felt like 20 minutes. He looked around the restaurant at the mostly empty tables, the dimmed track lighting the server wiping down the host stand near the door, and felt the evening shift in his mind from something surprising to something he needed to be careful about. The thought arrived the way doubt usually does, sideways dressed up as reason. She was a waitress. This was her job. Being warm, being present, making customers feel seen, All of that was part of the work. He had sat at her table for 2 hours and told her about his dead wife, and she had been kind about it, because being kind was professional, and because she was clearly genuinely a decent person. None of that meant anything more than what it was. He was a 42-year-old widower who had just had the worst blind date of his life, and he was sitting alone in a closing restaurant reading significance into a stranger's conversation because he was starving for it. That was all this was. He thought about the promise he'd made to himself in the months after Claire died. Not formal, never spoken out loud, but real. That he wouldn't let loneliness make decisions for him. That he wouldn't reach for someone just because the absence of connection had become its own kind of pain. He'd held that line for 4 years. He wasn't about to abandon it over a cup of coffee in a restaurant that was clearly trying to close. Dan put on his jacket. He left the money for the bill on the table, along with a tip that was larger than usual, the kind of tip that functions as a closing statement, a way of saying, the evening is done and settled, and he won't be back. He caught Mara's eye across the room. She was at the back counter making a note on her order pad. He walked over. "Thank you," he said. "Tonight wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be." It was an honest thing to say. Mara looked at him and offered a small, composed smile. "Good," she said. That was the idea. Dan nodded, once turned and walked toward the front door. He had almost reached it when his hand closed around the door handle, and he stopped. He stood there with the cold metal in his grip and thought about the evening. When Cheryl had walked out, he had been seconds away from following her, from paying the check immediately and getting back in his car and driving home and spending the night feeling like a fool. He had almost left. If he had, he would never have known what was waiting on the other side of staying. He had nearly missed all of it over the decision of one moment. And now he was standing at this door again, facing the same choice, wearing a different face. The question that moved through him was quiet, but it wasn't small if he walked out right now. Was this the second time he was about to miss something? He stood at the door with his hand on the handle and didn't move, the cold metal of it pressed against his palm. Through the glass panel he could see the parking lot, his truck under the amber light of the lamppost, exactly where he'd left it, pointed toward the exit, pointed toward home. It would take him 40 minutes to get back to the house. Noah would be asleep by now. He'd find the dishes stacked in the drying rack the way his son always left them, the television off the back porch, light on because Noah was afraid of the dark, but would never say so. It was a picture Dan knew by heart. He could close his eyes and walk through every room. That was the life waiting for him on the other side of this door. Quiet, known his. And for 4 years, that had been enough. He had told himself it was enough, and most of the time he'd believed it. He thought about what Mara had said, not just tonight, but in pieces throughout the evening. The way she'd sat in that chair without asking. The way she'd said what was she like instead of, "I'm so sorry," which was what everyone else always said, which was kind, but which also closed the door on the conversation before it began. The way she'd talked about her own life without making it a performance of resilience or a bid for sympathy. She just told him the truth about herself plainly and let him do the same. And somewhere in the middle of that, he had laughed, actually laughed for the first time in years. He thought about Noah's question. 3 weeks ago at the kitchen table, homework spread out in front of him, asking without looking up, "Dad, are you lonely?" Dan had not answered it then. He hadn't known how. But standing at this door now, he understood that the question had never really been about him, or not only about him. Noah was 10 years old and observant in the way quiet children are, and he had been watching his father move through the world like a man who had decided somewhere along the way to take up as little space as possible. Noah had noticed. Of course Noah had noticed. The fear was real. Dan wasn't trying to talk himself out of it or pretend it wasn't there. The fear of opening something up that he'd spent 4 years carefully closing. The fear of being wrong about this, of projecting warmth onto someone who was simply doing their job well and happened to be kind. The fear of what it would mean for Noah if Dan let someone into their life and it didn't hold. These were not small fears. They were the kind that came from actual experience, from knowing exactly what loss felt like from the inside. He thought about Claire, not carefully the way he usually did, the way you handle something fragile, but honestly. He thought about who she actually was, the way she'd once said during a stretch when he'd gone weeks barely leaving the house, "You're allowed to want things, Dan." That's not a character flaw. He had spent 4 years doing his best to forget it, but it had stayed anyway. Claire had never wanted him to build a wall. That had been his idea, not hers. He had done it in her name, told himself it was loyalty or grief, or the right way to honor what they'd had. But standing here at 10:45 on a Friday night, he understood that it hadn't been any of those things. It had just been fear, dressed up in something that looked nobler than it was. His hand was still on the handle. He hadn't moved. The parking lot waited on the other side of the glass, patient and indifferent. He let go of the door. He didn't rush it. He just opened his hand and stepped back and turned around. And the restaurant was still there, mostly empty now. The track lighting dimmed further, 2 servers finishing their side work near the bar. Mara was at a table in the middle section, wiping it down with a cloth in slow, methodical circles. She had her back half turned to him. When he walked back in, she heard his footsteps on the tile and looked up. She saw him standing there 5 steps inside the door, jacket still on. Something moved across her expression. Not surprise. Not quite. It was something quieter than surprise. The look of someone who had held out a small, careful hope and was now watching it take shape. Dan walked over. He stopped at the edge of the table she was cleaning and put his hands in his pockets. He didn't have a speech prepared. What came out instead was honest and slightly unsteady, the way true things often are when you say them out loud for the first time. "I don't know what this is," he said. "I'm not trying to make it into something it isn't. But I've been sitting here for 2 hours, and I realized I don't actually know your last name." Mara set the cloth down on the table. She looked at him steadily. "Mara Ellis," she said. "Daniel Calloway," he said. "People call me Dan." Neither of them said anything for a moment. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that settles between 2 people who have already said the harder things and are only now getting to the easy part. Mara picked up the cloth again, folded it once, and set it over the edge of the next chair. "The kitchen's closed," she said. "But the coffee machine isn't. You want another cup?" Dan looked at her. Then he pulled out the chair and sat down. "Yeah," he said. "I do." She came back with 2 cups, her own as well, which he hadn't expected, but which seemed right. She sat down across from him again, not in the cautious way of earlier in the evening, when the restaurant had still been full and she was technically on the clock. She sat the way a person sits when the work is done and there's nowhere else to be. Dan wrapped his hands around the mug. The restaurant was almost entirely quiet now. One of the other servers said goodnight on his way to the back, and then it was just the 2 of them, and the low hum of the refrigeration units behind the bar. They talked not about anything that required careful navigation. They talked the way people do when they're getting to know each other for the first time, and everything is still new enough to be interesting without being loaded. Mara asked questions that followed what he actually said, rather than leading him somewhere else. And Dan noticed this, the way you notice something you've been missing without knowing you were missing it. At some point, Mara said, "Can I ask you something?" Dan said yes. She said, "What made you come back in?" Dan thought about it honestly. "I almost left right after she walked out," he said. "I was about to walk out, and I didn't. Then I thought, if I go through that door right now, I'm making the same mistake twice in one night." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a good reason." She didn't make it bigger than it was. Just, "That's a good reason." Dan found that he agreed. It was almost 11:30 when Mara stood up to start closing down her section. Dan stood too, and this time there was no performance in it, no jacket pulled on with finality, no tip left as punctuation. He just stood up because the evening had reached its natural end, and they both knew it. He carried his mug to the counter near the server station because it seemed like the right thing to do. Mara took it from him, without comment, rinsed it in the small sink, set it upside down on the drying rack. She was tying off her apron when Dan said, "I'd like to do this again. Somewhere that isn't a restaurant where you're working." Mara looked at him. He added, because it felt fair to say, "No pressure on what that means. I'd like to not lose track of this, of talking to you." It wasn't elegant, but it was what he meant, and she seemed to understand that. She reached under the counter and tore a slip off the bottom of a blank order pad, narrow and pale yellow. She wrote her number in a quick, slanted hand. Blue ink, and handed it to him across the counter. Dan folded it once and put it in the chest pocket of his jacket. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. He walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the cold. The parking lot was nearly empty. His truck sat under the same lamppost where he'd left it. He got in, started the engine, and let it run for a moment before pulling out. The folded slip of paper sat on the passenger seat. He didn't look at it again. He already knew what was on it. The drive home took 40 minutes through quiet streets. He didn't turn on the radio. He just drove, watching the road unwind ahead of him. He thought about Noah's question. "Dad, are you lonely?" and how it had moved through him for 3 weeks and eventually landed him in a chair at Rosario's on a Friday night in a navy blue shirt. He thought about a door handle under his palm and the moment he'd let go of it. He pulled into his driveway at 12 minutes past midnight. The back porch light was on. He came in through the side door, set his keys on the hook, and walked down the hall to Noah's room. He pushed the door open an inch. Noah was on his side, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress the way he always slept. Dan stood in the doorway and looked at his son, the curve of his jaw, the dark lashes, the eyes that were Claire's and always would be. He felt the familiar ache of that. But tonight, underneath it, there was something else. Something small and new, and not yet nameable. Not happiness exactly, more like a window opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. Not a flood of light, just a shift in the air. He pulled the door back to its usual position and returned to the kitchen. He sat at the table in the dark. The folded slip of paper was still in his chest pocket. He could feel it there. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if he was ready, or what ready even looked like for a man who had spent 4 years deciding he had already arrived at the only life available to him. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find out.